Lecture 6.3.1 Operant Conditioning. In this module, we consider the simple idea that we either repeat a behavior or cease it depending on the outcome. In 1911, Edward Thorndike developed a simple behaviorist explanation of learning. He placed cats in puzzle boxes from which they could escape by various responses such as pressing a lever and/or pulling a string. As the data from one of Thorndike's experiments shows, the time that a cat needs to escape from a puzzle box gradually grows shorter, but in an irregular manner. He concluded that the cat did not at any point suddenly get an idea. Instead, reinforcement gradually increased the probability of the successful behavior. The curve of learning for cats indicated a slow, gradual, and consistent progress toward the solution. Thorndike noted that cats would learn to escape from puzzle boxes more quickly if the response selected produced an immediate escape. The cats would try a repertoire of behaviors to open the box and gradually learn to more quickly select the one that produced escape. Thorndike observed that when a cat is first placed in a puzzle box, it will engage in a wide range of behaviors or responses labeled R1, R2, R3. When one of these responses leads to escape, response R7, the future probability of that response increases until it becomes the most probable response. Thorndike referred to this as the law of effect. Thorndike described the law of effect this way. Of several responses made to the same situation, those which are accompanied or closely followed by satisfaction to the animal will, other things being equal, be more firmly connected to the situation so that when the situation recurs, they will be more likely to recur. This is the basic principle of operant or instrumental conditioning. It's called operant because the animal operates on the environment to produce an outcome. It's also known as instrumental because the animal's behavior is instrumental in producing the outcome. In operant conditioning, the subject's behavior determines an outcome and is affected by that outcome. Let's not make this too difficult. Operant conditioning is simply the process of changing behavior by following a response with a reinforcement, something we all do all the time. Students frequently have difficulty distinguishing between classical and operant conditioning. This is partially because the same terms are used with each but defined slightly differently. Conditioning is the simplest type of learning. Classical conditioning is the very simplest. Worms can be classically conditioned. For example, if you shock a worm, it'll contract. That's a reflex. If you sound a tone, it won't contract. But if you sound the tone, then shock, sound the tone, then shock, after a number of these acquisition trials, when you sound the tone, the worm will contract. Very, very simple nervous system, very, very simple type of learning. The textbook lists a number of differences between classical and operant conditioning. One is that the subject's behavior has no effect on the outcome with classical conditioning. That is, the CS or UCS is out of their control. It's an environmental event, not a behavior of the animal. In operant conditioning, the subject's behavior determines an outcome and is affected by the outcome. Another difference is that classical conditioning influences visceral, reflexive, involuntary responses, whereas operant applies to skeletal, somatic, so-called voluntary responses. This table of the differences between classical and operant conditioning appears in the textbook, but I prefer this table. In classical conditioning, we use the term response, whereas in operant conditioning, we use the term behavior. In classical, the response is biologically based, whereas in operant, the behavior is not biologically based. The main components in classical conditioning are the stimulus and its response. The main components in operant conditioning are behavior and its consequences. Classical conditioning cannot be used to shape behavior. Operant conditioning can be used to shape behavior. In classical, the stimulus causes the response. In operant, the consequences influence the behavior. To extinguish a classically conditioned response, you stop the pairing of the CS and the UCS. To extinguish operant conditioning, you stop presenting the reinforcement. What constitutes reinforcement? A reinforcer is defined as something that increases the likelihood of the preceding response. But this can be confusing because it leads to a circular explanation. It can also be confusing because although generally a reinforcer is pleasant, it doesn't have to be. What constitutes a pleasant event can be hard to define or vary from person to person also. It's hard to predict what will be reinforcing. Items that serve as reinforcers for one person might not for another. Biological usefulness doesn't always predict what will be reinforcing either, and sometimes people find the strangest things reinforcing. The Premack principle recognizes that what is a reinforcer for one individual may not be for another, and what works at one time may not work at another. The Premack principle states that the opportunity to engage in frequent behavior will be a reinforcer for any less frequent behavior. For example, if someone spends a lot of time watching television but does not study psychology very often, then the opportunity to watch television will reinforce studying psychology. The disequilibrium principle tries to address one problem with the Premack principle, namely that we are sometimes reinforced by opportunities for uncommon behavior. The disequilibrium principle states that each person has a preferred pattern of dividing time between various activities, and if a person is removed from that pattern, a return to it will be reinforcing. For example, an uncommon behavior for some of having sex with a partner might be a reinforcer for many more common behaviors, which is the opposite of the Premack principle. Primary and secondary reinforcers. Unconditioned or primary reinforcers are reinforcing because of their own properties. They meet primary biological needs and are found to be reinforcing for almost everyone. Food and drink are unconditioned or primary reinforcers. Conditioned or secondary reinforcers are effective because they have become associated with unconditioned or primary reinforcers. Money and grades are conditioned reinforcers. Punishment is defined as an event that decreases the probability of a response. Punishment can be the presentation of something, such as pain, or the removal of something, such as food. Based on a famous lab study with rats, described in the textbook, D.F. Skinner concluded that punishment temporarily suppressed behavior but produced no long-term effects. This was because the punished rats that he studied went back to pressing the bar to get food. The text says that a better conclusion would have been that punishment does not greatly weaken a response when no other response is available. For example, punishing you for breathing does not extinguish your breathing behavior. Mild, logical, and consistent punishment can be informative and helpful. The textbook has a discussion of spanking. Spanking is common in America, but illegal in some other countries, such as Sweden. Physical punishment has one clear benefit: immediate compliance. On the negative side, parents who spank their children are more likely than others to have ill-behaved children. Of course, it's possible that the spanking caused the children to become violent and poorly adjusted, but it's also possible that having a violent and poorly adjusted child led the parents to the spankings. This table of 4 categories of operant conditioning appears in the textbook. Positive reinforcement occurs when a response is strengthened because it is followed by the presentation of a rewarding stimulus. In contrast, negative reinforcement occurs when a response is strengthened because it is followed by the removal of an aversive or unpleasant stimulus. Both escape and avoidance training or learning involve negative reinforcement. In escape learning, an organism acquires a response that decreases or ends some aversive stimulation. The example shown in the slide is escape training. In avoidance training or learning, an organism acquires a response that prevents some aversive stimulation from occurring, which is slightly different than escape training. Passive avoidance also involves an aversive stimulus which the subject learns to avoid by being passive. This term is a little confusing and controversial. Many psychologists feel there is no real distinction between passive and active avoidance. That is, it's not clear to me how the example cited here of passive avoidance differs from avoidance learning. In the example, the guy learns to avoid getting slapped by avoiding giving insults, which seems the same as the definition of avoidance learning in the text. So if you too find this confusing, you're not alone. Finally, negative punishment is defined as punishment by avoiding something good. Once again, this is a very confusing definition that you won't find in every textbook. The example in the text is, if your parents punished you by taking away your allowance, they are using negative punishment. But how does this differ from avoidance training? Above it says, if you hit your little brother again, you'll get no dessert, which presumably will decrease the hitting behavior. But isn't this the same as saying you can avoid missing dessert by not hitting your brother? So I think that the terms and examples in the boxes in the upper right and lower left are confusing. I'm not sure what is gained by making such distinctions. And of course, there'll be no exam questions concerning these two definitions of negative punishment and passive avoidance learning. Under the subtopic Additional Phenomena of Operant Conditioning are some concepts that were described in classical conditioning and are also used in operant conditioning, although the procedures are a little different. These include extinction, generalization, discrimination, discriminative stimulus, and stimulus control. A response without a reward is an extinction trial. For example, if a rat presses a bar and no food pellet is delivered, then that is an extinction trial. When the animal stops responding, the response is said to be extinguished. Stimulus generalization in operant conditioning occurs when a new stimulus is similar to the original reinforced stimulus and triggers a response. For example, a pigeon trained to peck a colored disc in order to get food will also peck discs of other colors that are close by in the color spectrum. The more strongly the new stimulus is to the old, the more strongly the subject is likely to respond. An example in the book is, you reach for a turn signal in a rented car, the same place you would find it in your own car. Discrimination in operant conditioning occurs when someone is reinforced for responding to one stimulus, but not for responding to a similar stimulus. A discriminative stimulus is the stimulus that indicates which response is appropriate or inappropriate. Discriminative stimuli are cues that influence operant behavior by indicating the probable consequences, reinforcement or non-reinforcement, of a response. For example, drivers learn to slow down when the highway is wet and speed up when the highway is dry. Discriminative stimuli come to serve as a signal indicating that the response is likely to lead to a reinforcer. Stimulus control is all about learning to pay attention to and eventually responding differently to things we perceive in the environment, that is, stimuli. Why are some responses more easily learned than others? One possible explanation for this is the concept of belongingness, also known as preparedness. According to this concept, responses and reinforcers must belong together in order to produce the easiest conditioning. The definition of belongingness in the textbook is a species-specific predisposition to be conditioned in certain ways and not others. Thus, certain types of searching behavior are typical food-finding behaviors of certain species, and these behaviors are easy to condition using food as a reinforcer. However, behaviors that belong to other systems, say scratching, which is a grooming behavior, are harder to condition using food as a reinforcer. An example of prepared learning in humans, cited in the textbook, is that of turning a steering wheel right to move something clockwise, and vice versa. This is the example of belongingness cited in the textbook. You can easily train a dog to learn to use the direction of sound as a signal for which leg to raise, but they have trouble using the type of sound as a signal for which leg to raise. Animals are biologically prepared to learn certain stimulus-response associations easier than others.